Welcome to the Conduit Deeper podcast, a podcast that takes a deep dive into the details that surround our current sermon series, from current events to fascinating finds to conversations that take us deeper into the Word. Thanks for joining us.
Welcome to the Deeper Podcast. My name is Mo, executive pastor at Conduit Church, joined with our lead pastor, Darren Tyler, each and every week. Except for this past weekend, you were on the road.
I was out there. I was road dogging it back.
You were in Kansas City. Shout out to your childhood best friend, which if we're all lucky enough, we have one of those. You were lucky enough to have one of those.
Yeah, they say someday it's too late to make an old friend, right? And I happen to be lucky enough to have a couple of buddies that I mean literally grew up with, across the street. My little neighborhood, and I say neighborhood, the whole town had 2,000 people. Like, we have more people in our church than my hometown.
Right.
And, but there were these houses with five or six families now, I can't remember, that had 4 to 5 boys each, which was
rock and roll,
like a small terrorist organization. we were white trash terrorists. But he was one of those, and he
passed away.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about Troy was he was late to everything, but somehow managed to be early to heaven. So I'm not sure. It kind of makes me mad, but it was good to see a bunch of people I haven't seen in decades. And as Benny Prophet said, when all your friends start to look old, it's because you're old. And I was looking around going, I guess I'm old, because God, Dennis looks like he's old, and turns out he was, and so am I.
Speaking of old, we kind of covered that in Genesis chapter 5.
How about that segue is all I'm saying.
You like that?
Yeah.
More where that came from. We talked about Genesis chapter 5, genealogies, and I went ahead and jumped ahead. So you were in chapter 3, you wrapped up chapter 3. I went ahead and jumped into chapter 5.
And you were nervous about that because it's untoward. I don't know, why you and Anna, a bunch of people were like, oh, we can't skip ahead. And I'm thinking they do this all the time in streaming series. You go back and forth in timelines.
The skipping of timeline forward, flash forward, flashbacks. So we did a little bit of a flash forward into Genesis 5, which is all genealogies. And, one of the things that's kind of evident in studying Genesis 5 is that people it's listed that they lived hundreds of years, Methuselah being the oldest, living 969.
That's where the saying older than Methuselah comes from.
That's right, older than Methuselah. Almost 1,000 years, a millennia, and so, which begs the question, I mean, is that possible? Is that truly possible? Are those numbers listed where Adam, Seth, all the way down to Noah, 10 generations listed in Genesis chapter 5. The average age is 850.
Yeah.
Is that literal or symbolic?
What did you come up with in your preparation?
Well, it took me down and you've warned me of this, and I guess we're both guilty of this. We're both guilty of researching that takes us down rabbit holes that just completely distracts us from putting together a coherent teaching for Sundays.
I was watching one of our dogs yesterday throwing the ball, that's the game where we're going to play with the ball.
That's right.
And then inevitably, she'll get out there, the ball's there, and then something will catch her attention, and then she'll completely forget about the ball because she's sniffing around on this, and all of a sudden she's sniffing that, and the smell just takes hold of her, and she can't let it go, and that's what it feels like, especially Genesis. We're running for the ball, and then what is that? That smells, oh man. And then next thing you know, it's 8 hours later, and we're neck deep in
So, I mentioned it on one of the services. It's probably not as debatable and not as divisive as old Earth, young Earth.
Gosh, I don't know. I'm still shocked at how much I got my wrist slapped for that.
But the literal versus symbolic of ages in Genesis 5 is debatable. There's two factions of people.
Which did you find more credible?
I don't have a definitive answer. I think both are very interesting.
So you took a position on the old Earth, young Earth when you thought.
I did.
Yeah, but this one I
think I need more time.
Because I would say I'd say they're literal. So I was hesitant to take a position on old Earth, young Earth.
The thing that's thrown a curveball into the situation, I'm still studying this, so that's why I'm just asking for a little longer on this.
Which by the way, I don't know is actually a very reasonable answer.
Well, it's base 60 versus base 10 counting. Are you familiar with this?
Yeah.
And so this is new information for me. Understanding like what base 60 is in the counting system, which was used by the Sumerians and early cultures. Like the earliest of cultures used a base 60 system. It's where we get 60 seconds to a minute, 60 minutes to an hour, 360 degrees. They have a numbering system that's basically 12 factors. So a base 10 system is what, English, most of the world in English use. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. In a base 60 system, they use 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30, 60.
Right. If you hear noises in the background, we got some construction going on here, so you're going to have to bear with us.
And so because of that, those numbers, those long numbers could be different. They could be shorter because they were counting historically they would count months instead of years.
Yeah. And so to me the hole in that bucket is you see the decline. If you were to put it on a chart from, Adam to Abraham, you literally, and you were looking at it on a chart, which you're an Excel spreadsheet guy, you see it go down. And so my question for people that I've not found a credible answer yet, it's not that there's not one out there, is why was Abraham 120 and Adam was 900? If his factor of 60, does that mean that he was having babies at 5 years old, if we go by that counting?
Well, then it brings in, this is great, this is why we have a deeper podcast, it brings in this idea of Genesis 6:3, which also has some debate about it in terms of commentary. So Genesis 6:3 talks about the age going down to 120. This is pre-flood. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years." So again, another debate. Was that the Lord saying part of the judgment is that you will not live longer than 120 years? And so from that point on,
right,
man kind of maxed out at 120.
Right. And so then the question, why did we need factor of 60 before the flood and we don't need it after the flood? To me, that actually further cements the literal nature of it, which is the flood is why we're... And have you heard Hugh Ross's theory on this?
No. I wanted to bring it up.
Yeah.
So we had 20 bullet points and got to 2 of them.
It literally, people don't, and there'd be no way to know this, but there's so much but you've only got 30 minutes, right?
Yeah.
Or in my case, 45 lately, which I'm very sorry about to the parking lot team for that.
You have to figure that out.
But it's like literally like a Brazilian meat house, or is that what they're called? Like where they just shave and meat? Because I'm like, I can't go here. I just,
So what's his take?
His take is that, and of course, he would say this extremely more eloquently, and I still wouldn't understand it. So I'm going to do my best. That astronomers know about a single, what was it called? I'm going to Google. I don't want to get this wrong. Is a supernova, a single event, supernova, something.
Yeah.
That happened in the neighborhood, in their words, between 10 and 20,000 years ago. This is what astronomers believe. And at this point, it actually increased the harmful radioactive rays.
Yeah, didn't he call it cosmos radiation or something like that?
Yeah, it was nucleotide rays, heavy nucleotide rays, which are the bad ones, which I don't, there's good rays, there's bad rays. As far as my wife is concerned on the beach, they're all good. But what he was getting at is that these are the harmful rays that are here. And if you were, literally, you could see it on, whether God used a literal thing like this, a supernova, singular event, whatever. we know that it was God's will that we don't live as long anymore. And actually, this might have been Hugh Ross's thing, because, like, you know, if you're a serial killer, this classic Hugh Ross, like, say something completely like, whoa, but say it like so mathematically. You know, think how many people you could kill if you were a serial killer and you lived 900 years. Right. You know, God needed us, like it was an act of mercy for us, which I've read from multiple different. And it's true. Like, it's like if entropy is true, like the older we get, it's not that we get more holy the older we get. You know, think about how much damage and war and murder was being caused because they could just live longer with it. And the longer you live, the more destruction you can cause. The idea in Silicon Valley, of course, is if we live longer, that's somehow a really good thing for humanity, which presumes, again, that we are good at the core of who we are. And so if we live longer, we could spread more good. That's a demonstrably false premise to start with. And the idea that we evolve and get better is, do we get wiser? Do we get softer? Yeah, but we still are humans at the end of it. And you look at some of these old dictators around the earth, from Idi Amin, you know, Pol Pot, whatever. They did way worse things in their 80 years than if they had 1,000 years. They could have wreaked destruction on us.
It's just wild to think that, because it says in I think it's the last verse of Genesis chapter 5, that Noah fathered his 3 sons at 500 years old.
Right? Do you know who Willard Scott is, if I say that name? Mike has no idea what I'm talking about. So there was a guy who used to be on the Today Show named Willard Scott. He was like the Al Roker, like a white Al Roker. And they would do this morning thing, like they would wish whoever had a 100th birthday with a little Smucker's jelly. And happy birthday to, you know, Wilma Verena from Omaha, Nebraska, 102 years old. Yeah. Like, I was like, if Willard Scott would have been around, do they wait till they're 900 before they get to be on the Today Show? Like, happy birthday, you know, Willard, she's got a 903 years old today. With
it's
her
just wild to think that someone could live that old. I mean, it's just impossible for our brains to understand that. But the conditions of the earth at that time and in the human body,
right,
it was in a purest form.
Which is, as in the days of Noah, what is happening with Silicon Valley billionaires right now is they are trying to reverse engineer, because at the core of our DNA, there is evidence that if they can reverse specific things in the genome, that they can reverse aging. And their lifespans that they are talking about are very much in line with the lifespans of Genesis 1 through 11.
It's so true. Did you listen to the Kurzweil interview?
I couldn't. I tried.
With
he kept making me angry,
Rogan.
And I couldn't hit him.
And he was interviewed recently by Lex Friedman as well, which, I mean, those are two very monotonous voices talking to each other.
Simultaneously,
they actually sound like AI robots, ironically. But
Friedman might be AI.
But I mean, we touched on this a little bit ago, but Kurzweil, I mean, he is absolutely convinced, as are his cohorts, that, you know, 500 years is within reach.
And if technology is the only problem, then they're right. We can solve it with technology, right? But that's not the problem. The problem is deeper than that. The sin of generation to generation.
Yeah, I touched on that on Sunday. That and we've talked about it here too. That the new buzzword is flaw.
Yeah, because it's easier. You don't have to repent of a flaw.
Yeah, you can fix a flaw.
Yeah, yeah. That at the core of the science, at least as I've read it, on paper, this looks doable. Like, there are certain thinkers right now that have said that if you are lucky enough to live another 5 years, this is how fast they're saying this is moving.
Yeah, by 2030.
Yeah, if you live another 5 years, you could possibly live to 500 years, because whatever's happening is happening so quickly.
Yeah, so like my grandson and granddaughter, soon to be, they will now have the potential, because they'll be 5 years old in 5 years.
Yeah.
That the technology, the biotechnology that will exist by the time they're in their teens and early 20s will allow them to live much longer than their ancestors, than their grandpa.
Yeah. And so, like, I'm no prophet, right? I'm no Sid Roth supernatural show. There's that for a niche comment. Have you ever watched that show?
I've heard the name.
It'll be an hour of your life. You're never getting back. But if they succeed at this, you go back to as it was in the days of Noah. Like, if they succeed at this, you could see how Jesus has to return, because if we get back to a place where people are living 500-600 years, the people that could afford to do that right now, I mean, think about
right. Yeah, that's the other part of it.
The people that would have the money in Silicon Valley or DC or whatever to do this. I don't want Joe Biden to live 500 years. Now, at this point, I think it's like Weekend at Bernie's with our president right now. I keep feeling like they're just rolling him out on a refrigerator dolly and hitting play. But the idea that some of the people that we would have in charge, Gavin Newsom living for 500 years, imagine how bad California would be if he had 500 years. He's destroyed it in 5, right? Like, imagine what he could have done in 500. But that said, if this is not a thus saith the Lord. It's just I'm really intrigued by that idea that, as in the days of Noah, what if that is part of it? Is that certainly we're trying to do it, but if they succeed at it.
Who's the oldest member of your family? I mean, who lived the longest in your family that you can remember?
We have no what do you call centenarian? No, centurion. Those are Romans. What are the
centenarians?
Centenarians. Is that what
someone that's lived past 100?
Somebody Google 100. No, my grandparents on my mom's side and my dad's side both lived well into their 80s, early 90s on I think I've joked about it, but a diet of coffee and Crisco. Like it was
defies all.
Right? My great-grandmother, the prairie woman from the Comstock family, I mean, she lived to 85. And I mean, she had her cast iron skillet with Crisco. We ate bacon and pork chops. It was
coffee and cigarettes.
God, it was glorious. We didn't smoke in ours, so we weren't.
Okay,
I mean, we said we were white trash. I guess we were adjacent to it. We didn't smoke, which is I don't know how that happened actually.
I don't know. Hillbillies from Appalachia smoke. I know that much.
Oh yeah, they do. Cuss you out and smoke without losing the cigarette, like from their mouth. Yeah,
it's impressive. That was my grandfather.
What about you? Like on your side, like you guys got old people?
No, they all died of emphysema.
Yeah, smoking like a chimney.
Oh my gosh, my grandfather took his last breath smoking a cigarette with emphysema. I mean, literally his last breath. He just puffed one more.
Wow.
He was like, might as well. I'm going down with the ship. My granny lived, so it was my grandmother's sister. We called her Granny.
Of course she did. That's a hillbilly one.
96. And yeah, I mean, that's 96 is old. But she didn't act like it. We called her the Energizer Bunny. Like, you just could not keep her down.
Yeah.
She just woke. I mean, she just didn't wake up one day. It was just she had so much energy. It was amazing. But the point being is, over the years, lifespans have changed, right? So I did a little bit of research. Back in 1776, the average lifespan, the average age of an American in 1776, when America was formed, 35 years old. Average. So that what pushed that down is obviously births.
Infant mortality, yeah.
Infant mortality.
Yeah, one of the things about Tennessee, something in Tennessee that I never saw this in Nebraska. Maybe they had it in Ohio, but because it was an older part of the country. But we got one behind the church here, like these Civil War era cemeteries, because somebody, where everybody was cut off from everybody else because the mountains. But the amount of babies that are buried in those places is significant, because
wasn't cholera a big thing back then in the statewide?
Yeah, I mean it was obviously because of sewage and things that they just didn't know about as far as cleanliness and antibiotics and all that. But yeah, I mean it was a third world country. Yeah. Up until the 1900s, the United States was still a third world country.
It's funny how it's romanticized.
Yeah, right.
The 1800s, Little House on the Prairie, and all these period pieces that kind of romanticizes that era. And there's elements of it that we do long to return to.
Yeah,
I mean, if not the healthcare side or
the scalping. Like I'm not a fan of scalping.
Right.
I'm not a fan of arrows. Like I mean I think it was they actually modeled that in one of those Taylor Sheridan movies. But
yeah,
like most of the times when you died with an arrow, it wasn't from the wound; it was from the infection, because they would dip it like in feces, in manure, to poison them. And somehow they knew that was bad enough to,
that'll do it.
So that, you end up dying with a hole in you, but you're also dying of a massive infection with no way to fight it.
So 1776, average age is 35. Up until recently, the average age in America has been, what, 78?
78. CDC is down, adjusted that down to 76, 77.
Is that because of the last 4 years?
Yeah. The headlines are hilarious, though, because they blame COVID. In fact, even the CDC's website, they blame it on COVID when they talk about excess deaths. And then if you dig deep into the article, it starts talking about it was 12% of those numbers were actually COVID. The other 78% are, and they say COVID related, but what they need to say is policy related. It was people not getting medical treatment that they should have gotten. 3% of that is suicide that has gone up in the last 4 years. Turns out when you isolate and do, people apart from each other, there's consequences to that stuff. And that's accurate worldwide. They blame it on COVID, but it's the policies that are doing it. It says, in fact, this is from the CDC site that, and this is intriguing to me, that while overall mortality increased, right, people dying more, dying, global deaths in children saw a decline in 2020 and 21. Total of 5.2 million under the age of 5 died in 2019 versus 4.6 in 2021. So I don't know if that's because less children were born, but it drives to the point that the average death of COVID was 78, and the average death in America is 78. So, did they die from COVID, or it's the old argument from it. But the point is that our mortality rate, being studied right now is, gosh, what was it? The last. Do you have the numbers of how it was like in the 50s? Because we saw a huge increase in the 1900s. Like all those numbers you're talking about, 35, whatever, they stayed pretty steady.
Yeah, it really wasn't until between 1950 and 2000 that it jumped into the 70s.
Yeah.
So fairly recent.
Right.
I mean, zoom out. I mean, that's not that long ago.
No.
That we've increased mortality rate by a decade.
Yeah. And globally, that was one of the things that was just absolute madness. It made me want to throw my computer through a window, because you'd hear these people talking about the mystery of why COVID deaths didn't happen in Africa and Haiti. But the average death in Haiti, the average mortality is 62, I think. So the average death rate of COVID is 78. So the reason was that these are perfectly healthy, in shape, but the people that were most at risk had already died from other causes by then.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, I'm thinking a lot about this, because, Mo, if you can see him on the camera here, we're not CGI on this. He's actually, he's skinny. But it was from sugar and the food that you've been eating, and that you go back to, again, the pre-flood, whatever. But just the processed foods alone. When you look at what most of the premature deaths in Haiti, it's diabetes, it's heart, it's some cancer, but mostly heart. And then you look at their diet, and it's all cheap processed foods from America.
Yep.
Pastas, a lot of sugar. I mean, you could almost stand a fork up in their coffee. They put so much processed sugar in it.
Don't get me started.
But the insulin, all that stuff is causing their mortality to be as low as it is. But that goes back to the idea of why, our rate of decline in the modern world is they didn't have those problems in the first few thousands of years of humanity.
We're so far removed from the garden. One of the other things that I purposefully stepped around on Sunday, it was kind of ironic how many things that were actually in chapter 5 that you wouldn't think for a chapter that is dedicated to genealogy. And there's actually a lot of rabbit holes potentially in there. One of which was Enoch, who walked with God and didn't die. And him and God just went on an eternal walk somewhere.
Right.
He just went with him. Where they went, don't exactly know. Obviously into heaven. But how they got there, why he chose him.
Right.
It's so fascinating to me.
Is the language Enoch was, and then he was not?
He was not.
He was not. It's so eloquent, and then he wasn't.
And he wasn't. He was there, and then he wasn't. But they were together, which was really cool. I kind of talked about that for a minute, but
yeah, what were you tiptoeing about, though?
The fact that Enoch apparently wrote a book. He's an author. apparently. So this Book of Enoch, many of you probably know about the Book of Enoch or have heard of the Book of Enoch.
Yeah.
The Book of Enoch has a lot of very interesting topics in it. There's the Book of Watchers that's in this book that talks about angels and watchers that descended to the earth, leading to Nephilim, that we're going to talk about in chapter 6. It has the Book of Parables, an astronomical book, describes the movement of heavenly bodies.
Yeah.
There's I forget how many chapters are in it, but there's a ton of pre-flood information in this book that was handed down and used for centuries. It's believed to have been written, long ago.
Yeah.
But not canonized and not a part of Scripture.
Right.
But referenced. Any insights you have on the Book of Enoch?
I don't know why it has to be so controversial. Jesus quoted it, Jude, and Peter.
Yeah.
I think it's 2 Peter.
Yes,
and so
2 Peter.
So I've personally have landed in the world of, on any given Sunday, I'll quote John MacArthur or Tim Keller, Dr. David Jeremiah. Like, I will quote commentaries, but I don't quote them with the same authority that I would the canonized Scripture.
Sure.
And so it means that they're helpful and that they are inherently human, but still trustworthy. And so if Jesus is quoting Enoch, if Peter is quoting Enoch, if Jude is quoting Enoch, then they found it to be trustworthy. Historian
Josephus also referenced Enoch.
Did he? Okay. And when they found the Dead Sea Scrolls, so the question is, what was the early church reading? What was the people that Jesus was with, the Jews in that era, what were they reading? The Maccabees, like what were they? And tucked in between, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and the Torah was the Book of Enoch. So not only were they reading it, they were preserving it to be saved. And a lot of people, I didn't know this, like when you go to the spot where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, they were found by a little shepherd kid. They were just out playing in the desert, throwing rocks into caves like kids do, and they heard glass shatter, like pottery shattering. Like, wait, what was that sound? That's not... So they find these scrolls, and for a long time, nobody even knows the significance of them. By the time they figured out the significance and they got them out of Israel into, I want to say New York, was right as the 1948 war was happening. Wow. And the Muslim armies were coming in. Had they have found those, so there's one thing we know as far as the Arab states have gone, and that is that they've done everything in their power to destroy anything that connects the Jewish people to the land before the Arabs got there. They would have been destroyed. And when I say right before, I'm talking like a day. Like, this was a nail biter moment where these things were, I would go so far as to say miraculously rescued. Because the significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls was that for centuries, one of the main critiques of Judaism and Christianity was, well, we don't know that these are accurate. We don't know that this is what they were reading. These could have been changed and altered. And what the Dead Sea Scrolls proved was that not only were these legitimate documents, but they are 99.9% the exact same Book of Psalm that we have now from the Book of Psalms. So 99.9% accurate to, and the only things that are not identical would be like a punctuation or a letter or like nothing that changes the meaning. So 99.9%. So these were monumentally found. And the fact that Enoch was found in the middle of that, to me says God was preserving that as well for some reason. Not as canonized, not as inspired, but as a commentary that helps us to fill in some of the gaps of our knowledge or comments. Like, oh yeah, that's what they meant when they said that.
There's 4 main reasons for canonical status.
I just literally have no idea if that's right, but it sounded good when I said it.
I think it's canonical.
And I said it with confidence, which makes it right.
The 4 main reasons are issues of authorship, regional acceptance, doctrinal alignment, and rabbinic Judaism's canon criteria. One of the issues of doctrinal alignment seems a bit of a stretch, and that is that it contains unconventional ideas about angels and cosmology. Now, because it's complex.
Yeah.
And they were kind of like, I don't know about this, especially what comes up in chapter 6 of Genesis, which is detailed in the Book of Enoch. Is it because it got too weird and too blurry that they just didn't want to deal with it?
I don't think so. I think the early church, part of the canonization was, this is what the early church was reading. This is what the early church was basing, risking their lives for. So even like the New Testament letters, the New Testament epistles and tellings, there were others, Thomas and like there are others. But when it came down to it, like it's like with us today, like there's lots of literature out there, but what are the ones that we all kind of just know, we all just sort of have agreed on and we've landed on? And, the church was considerably smaller then. But the idea that like Constantine just rolled in and created a Bible is just inaccurate. Like he was behind it, right? But again, God uses governments all the time to get his will done. That's not like a brand new idea that God, came up with or stopped doing after Jesus was on the earth. And when it came to Enoch, my understanding of it is that it was read by the early church, but it wasn't canonized in Judaism. Like it wasn't one of the things that the Jewish people would view as like Torah. They weren't viewing, right. But at the same time, they viewed it as a trustworthy, as far as, history. And obviously, they were reading it. Like they saved it. This group of Jews that saved the rest of the Torah saved Enoch alongside of it. So they clearly valued it. They just didn't canonize it.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah, if you haven't had a chance to read through it or study it a little bit, I would encourage you, check it out. It's fascinating. It's a fascinating read. It'll be really helpful when we get to this next chapter here.
Yeah, it is helpful because it's where it gets really uncomfortable in our era of modernity is people are very uncomfortable. Westerners are very uncomfortable with the supernatural.
Yeah,
which when you go back to the Enlightenment period, when all of a sudden everything is science, which means it's observable, repeatable, all those things. It really stripped away in Western mindset a lot of the supernatural underpinnings. And I think I could say, for me anyway, there was a period of my life where I would talk about supernatural things and that I believed in them, but then I didn't live like I believed it. I would sort of explain away things. And now after you spend as much time in Africa or Asia as I have, you're like, oh, never mind. Like they have no problem with it. The Enlightenment skipped Africa. And the fact is they're better for it, I think, in many, many ways because they read the Bible. It's one of the things Michael Heiser says is that if you're going to read it in context, it does mean, right, the context of the Bible itself and context of the verses around it, but Heiser adds on to that and the context of the understanding of the writer and the original readers of that document, that what would they have meant by it and what would they have understood in reading it. That's what he means by in context of the culture in which it was written. Now, my humble opinion, maybe it's prideful, Heiser, he takes that a long ways. In some ways where it's like, man, I don't know, you weren't there, so how do you know what they were ultimately?
True.
But there's things where he stretches a little bit. I say he stretched. He's gone to be with Jesus now. But by and large, Unseen Realm, the Reversing Hermon, like those are books that very helpful. Like for instance, this is information from the Book of Enoch, that the Watchers, this type of creation that came down to conspire against God through the daughters of men, sons of God, which is where the Nephilim, Genesis 6, all that. The Book of Enoch says that happened on Mount Hermon, which is now Syria, and then northern Israel. At the base of Mount Hermon is Caesarea Philippi, which is where Jesus took his disciples and declared that the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. If you look at it on a map, he was going from Galilee to Jerusalem. So this would be like us going from Nashville to Chattanooga, but we go through Knoxville. You can do that, but it's out of the way. And it's a lot out of the way when you're walking. So why did Jesus choose that spot? One answer, possibly, probably. With, it is with God. He's doing 1,000 things at any moment. And if you know 2 of them, you're blessed. The gates of hell is where in Caesarea Philippi, where the god Pan was worshipped, Peter Pan, the demonic, and it was a cave, and they would throw children and sacrifice babies in this evil pagan place. And he stood there and said that the gates of hell will not prevail against my church. But it's at the base of Mount Hermon, which is where the watchers. So it was like Jesus went to Mount Hermon, and then it says immediately afterwards he went to a high mountain to pray, and it was where he was transfigured. There's different possibilities of where the transfiguration happened, but to me, the most likely is the mountain he's standing at the base of. He went to a high mountain immediately after. It's right there. He was literally standing at the base of Hermon, and he was transfigured, right? It's Moses, Elijah, and by reading the Book of Enoch, it's like, oh, this makes sense. It's where Heiser's book, Reversing Hermon, comes from. He starts there, and then it's from there, it says he set his face like a flint towards Jerusalem to be crucified, is where he was headed. But he went to Hermon first, and it was like him sending a parting shot, a salvo against the enemy. This is where you started the rebellion. This is where the rebellion stops here and moves from there. So the Book of Enoch has lots of valuable information. You just have to treat it like a commentary and not like a inspired scripture.
That was a really good. That was a really good encapsulation of the Book of Enoch, and not to get ahead of ourselves a little bit too,
a little bit,
but when we head into chapter 6, we may be referencing even more of this. But that was a good synopsis of why and how that it can be useful.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I came across too in studying this was in the spiritual, we call it blessings and cursings. Generational blessings, generational curses, which is also a bit of a landmine.
I think we probably need to disabuse ourselves of the notion that everything's a landmine these days with the internet.
Oh my word. But the scientific side of that has emerged, and through a field of study called epigenetics, which I didn't know much about. I think I'd heard that before, but in researching it, it's an emerging field of science.
Yeah.
Which basically is the study of transferred trauma genetically from generation to generation on a genetic level, which is unbelievable that this is coming to be. There was a rather large study conducted about 8 years ago of Holocaust survivors and their DNA structures. And then they did pulled the same data from their children and their grandchildren. And they found in the grandchildren that there was a epigenetic link to show increased rates of stress disorders in their grandchildren at an early age that they had not yet experienced.
So they're saying that the stress, they're experiencing stress, but no cause of the stress, outward cause.
Right.
Interesting.
That it had been handed down genetically, and that the genetics had been modified, had been changed over the course of 2 generations. Inherited stress, inherited disorders.
Gosh, that reminds me of, I should Google it, Deuteronomy 6, I think. The sins of the father. It's where God is a jealous God, and the sins of the father are visited upon the children to the 3rd generation.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. I think in Deuteronomy, I think it's fourth generation. We fact check ourselves. Regardless, the 3rd or 4th generation.
Sure, I'm sitting here like I don't have a computer in front of me.
Yeah, the sins of the fathers into the 3rd or 4th generation. I guess that's that's kind of my point, is that on a scientific level,
it's the third and the fourth generations. You're right.
Yeah, I think it says it both. It scientifically is supporting that claim, that truth.
Yeah.
In Deuteronomy, that the decisions that we make, both on a spiritual level, emotional level, emerging science is showing that on an actual physical level, it transfers.
The Body Keeps the Score.
Man, such a good book.
Was, for me, I mean, for my wife and I both, like, when you carry that, it literally, it causes physical illness. I mean, which is a biblical idea as well, by the way. But it's wild. It's like, all like that research is just showing what the Bible said to be true. Now, we might call it trauma, but if you've experienced trauma, what you've experienced is someone sinning against you. And the thing about shame, it's something that everybody has experienced, is whether it was done to you or done by you, we carry the shame in the same part of our hearts. And the idea of the sins, I think, is it Pete Scazzaro that says that Jesus might be in your heart, but your grandfather is in your bones?
Yes.
Having done work with a counselor and a therapist, they spend an enormous amount of energy on your father, your family of origin, your mother. But when Scazzaro did that, I'm like, oh, that explains a ton. So you're talking the third generation.
Yeah, and they actually define, in the study of genealogy, they define family of origin by third or fourth generation.
So in genealogy,
Yes.
So therapy, they're describing it as just parents, but genealogy, they're saying grandparents and grandparents.
Yes. So
I was reading, this is, I stumbled onto a book about my ancestors, which I joke because it's such a fun name, Erastus Comstock.
It's a great name.
You bet Erastus. But I swear I'm not making this up. I was reading an account of a family that was on the Oregon Trail, and they stayed at the Comstock Ranch, which is where my heritage is. And their description of Erastus Comstock, he had newspapers from New York, literature, like they were describing me. And it was like, I mean, I was on a plane. I'm like, my eyes were as wide as they could be. I'm like, oh my gosh.
Yeah.
He is in my bones. He was a pioneer. And even with the way they described him, funny, like I've never met this guy. He was dead long before I came along. I was reading newspapers by the time I was 12. When I was 16, 17, and then I was a waiter. I've said it, my most exciting time was when someone walked away and left their Wall Street Journal on the paper so I could read the news between waiting on tables. And that's, somehow genetically this stuff just passes through. Yeah. And at the same time, so if the positive does, so does the negative. And it's again, we can frame it as trauma, childhood wounds, all that. And it might explain my behavior, but it doesn't excuse it.
That's right.
Because at some point, I'm still sinning in the same way that Erastus was, right? And repentance is the answer, not diagnosis. And I say that with hopefully with humility and with understanding that there are people who are battling with anxiety, with panic attacks and all. You didn't necessarily choose it, but you chose behaviors that led you to it, which is a little bit what I'm going to be talking about on Sunday with Cain and Abel, that, you do sin until sin does you. It talks about it as an entity crouching outside your door, waiting, for you. And the words is you're either going to rule over it or it's going to rule over you. And the sins of our fathers being visited upon us, is spiritual. And it's provable, demonstrably provable through DNA. But when you think about why does God hate sin so much? Why is he so angry about sin? Look what it does to us personally, and look what it does to those we love individually. And now the lens of God is, if he's my father, someone sins against my son, I'm furious about it. Someone hurts him. So if I'm hurting one of God's children, it's why the cross matters so much, because his anger is justified. And at the same time, there's got to be some way to get mercy out of this. or we're all going to be wiped off the earth, Genesis 6 style. But because of his mercy, right, his mercy endures. But it doesn't mean that the consequences. So that's it. I've only heard of epigenetics in the form of like cancer research, but that's really interesting. This thing I love about the Bible, and you reference like the Sumerian kings or any of these ancient writings, none of them hold up under light of scientific scrutiny. Like scientific scrutiny that you look at it like, it's contradicted, that couldn't be or what, but the Bible just keeps being confirmed over and over and over again. We might have we call it a natural explanation, but this is supernatural. This is God, punishing, and in many ways having mercy, right, because of short lifespans. But it's when God says, I'm going to do this, I'm going to make their life be 120 years, he wasn't kidding. And here we are, thousands of years later.
Yeah. If you're interested in reading that book, The Body Keeps the Score, author Bessel van der Kolk. He's a Dutch psychiatrist. It's not a Christian book per se.
Not even kind of.
But a psychology book that is it's incredible read if you're really interested in that type of thing, especially if you have experienced traumas or generational type things in that way. It definitely gives insight into how and where those come from and how to overcome them.
Yeah. Yeah, and at the end of the day, I mean, I feel like that's what, when my wife and I read it together, she'd struggled with rheumatoid arthritis since we were married. I mean, 24 years old. And now, after I remember the first time we actually did when I went to, it's been, I guess, a couple years ago now, when she and I did a week with the counselor in Florida that focuses just on senior pastors. And you start out the session of 5 days by telling, your story. And she shared her story. And the therapist was like, I would just like to acknowledge that's a lot. Like, that's a lot. Which was helpful for my wife to hear that. They should be acknowledged. Like, that really was a lot. And at the same time, the realization that, and you've been carrying this stuff inside of you. Yeah. And she hasn't taken medication in 3 years now.
Incredible.
With it. But it started with that book, The Body Keeps the Score. And, you look at it and, it's her story to tell. So maybe I'll just reframe it with mine. My grandfather was a raging alcoholic, Red Manchu and Budweiser, completely abandoned. My dad went into the Army when he was 18, lied on it. He had epilepsy and lied on his application just so he could get out of his abusive father's home.
Wow.
Like horrible situation. But my grandfather, kind of like your father, he was adopted from like boys' home in Omaha in the early 1900s. So he was 12 years old when he was adopted. So he'd had plenty of time to remember being shipped off to a
absolutely
boys' home. So the sins of his father visited upon his son, visited upon my father, visited upon me, and visited upon Ethan, right? Because
True.
It doesn't, like when he talks about that Deuteronomy, it does not like it's only 4 generations, then we start over again. Everybody's carrying their generational. So mine goes to the 4th generation, right? Ethan's will go to the 4th generation. This is the story of sin in humanity, and it's why God has to eventually wipe it out, or it's going to wipe us out.
Yeah. And it all points to Jesus, right? I mean, that's the beauty of it. That's the crazy part of it. If you do the genealogical study all the way from Adam to Noah to Moses, to, Abraham, I got out of order there a little bit. All the way to David to Jesus, there's a lineage, there's a story being told here.
Yeah.
Of sovereignty.
Yeah.
And that he's coming back. That's the last part of the story for justice.
Yeah. What I love about the genealogies is they matter. Yeah. Like when you're reading through the 1-year Bible program, you get to the genealogies and it's like skip day. It's like skipping legs day, at the gym. But if you'll focus on them,
yeah.
Like you just said, there's a story behind every one of them. And, if you're somebody who believes that maybe they, like oftentimes in ancient genealogies, they might have skipped 2 or 3 generations because it's grandfather to grandson, whatever. Even that still tells you that, well, the ones that were included matter.
Right.
right? When you start looking at Rahab the harlot included in that list, like they mattered. And when you look at Bathsheba being included in that, like Bathsheba, the one that David murdered her husband, right? Committed adultery, and she's in the mom that gets to be in the bloodline of Jesus. It's telling a story with it. And when you look at it, I think it's Matthew and Luke. I don't remember which one does this, but when they get to David, they take a parallel paths, and one leads to Mary and one leads to Joseph. And it matters because the bloodline of Jesus, specifically from Eve all the way through, like you said, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, all the way through David, all the way to a little town in Bethlehem, to a girl named Mary, right? And to a man named Joseph, all came through that bloodline.
And it's interesting we call it bloodline because it required for blood to be shed that was pure to rid ourselves of the sin, the curse through the blood of Christ.
Have you read there's this guy that, I can't remember his name. He's from Tennessee. I think he's passed away. Jason loves him, our worship guy. But Rogan was quoting him. I just saw this in a clip. I don't even know what show it came from. But he claims to have, I don't know if you've read this, but he claims that he has a long time ago discovered where the Ark of the Covenant was underneath the Temple Mount, and the blood of Jesus had dripped, and they had done DNA testing on it. Is any of this true?
I don't know if it's true, but I know.
His name's Ron Wyatt.
Ron. How is it that our 23-year-old producer knows that and I don't? But Ron Wyatt. I don't know if he's nuts or not. But that's a bold claim. But the point being, they said they tested the blood and that the blood did not have male DNA in it. It was just the YY chromosome or whatever. There was not a father. Yeah. Now, the reason I don't know is because, that feels like the kind of thing, if it were true,
everybody would know.
Oh, yeah. Everybody. Catholics would have made hay with that. And on the other hand, I'm looking at it now thinking that logic is completely illogical because there are lots of things that have been very true that are just suppressed by
that would be incredible
powers.
Though, man.
But I mean, it was funny to hear Rogan quoting it. I'm like, Ron Wyatt? How do you even find out? He's got some museum about an hour away from here in some little tiny town in Tennessee.
Sounds like a field trip.
You know what? Let's do a staff day to Ron Wyatt. Jason would volunteer to drive if we did that. He gets genuinely excited in the same way that my dog gets excited when I just pick up the ball.
Right.
You mentioned Ron Wyatt, and Jason will be like,
he's all in.
I'll get the ball. I'll get it.
So we continue Genesis. We continue Genesis by going back to chapter 4.
Yep.
You alluded to it. This is where it starts to get real spicy, as if it wasn't already spicy. But we're now entering the chat is some murders and some bloodshed.
Yeah.
And I alluded to this on Sunday, but it didn't take very long to go off the rails for humanity.
No, and obviously got bad rapidly because again they were living longer, so they were able to. They just got worse and worse as they got older and older.
I mean, we're talking Adam and Eve's children start killing each other. So we're into the second generation.
Yeah,
and we've lost the plot.
Yeah, there's a line in there, verse 7, I think, that sin is crouching at your door, and to me it sort of comes down to the question of, do you want to be open the door to the lion that wants to dine on you, or do you want to open the door to the lion that wants to dine with you?
That's good.
And Jesus is the Lion of the tribe of Judah, right? Satan, I think it's 2 Peter's or 1 Peter's referred to as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour.
1 Peter 5.
So if you're going to open the door, you're either going to be dined with or dined on. Those are our two options.
Aslan.
Yeah, 100%. And that's what Cain did. I mean, Cain, and we're going to talk about why was Abel sacrificed the one that God loved. You have to let the Bible interpret the Bible, and Hebrews 11:4 interprets that for us. We're going to talk about that. And at the end of the day, golly, it's golly, like I'm Andy Griffith all of a sudden. It's just true. Like if you are going to participate in, it's like sin is not just a behavior, it's an entity, it's a presence, and it is crouching at the door for us. And so hellfire and brimstone preachers aside, we ought to know what it is, what it means, what sin is. I mean, this is literally the problem with humanity. It's the problem with me individually. Is it G.K. Chesterton that wrote the essay that, hey, what's wrong with humanity? And he just wrote, I am, and ended his thesis, because it's all of us. And we have a decision whether it's going to rule us or we're going to rule it. But there's no middle ground.
It's great. Glad you're back. Be in the saddle this weekend. Back on schedule.
Yeah, I'm glad to be back too. Although I still haven't listened, but I heard you crushed on Sunday. So well done.
It was fun. It was a good day. Thank you for joining us on this Deeper podcast. If you are watching this on YouTube, we'd ask that you would like it, perhaps, if you did like the podcast. Go ahead and push like and then subscribe. When you do that, anytime that we upload or post, you'll get notified that the next one is available. If you are listening to this on Spotify or Apple Music or wherever you listen to podcasts, would you go ahead and give us one of those 5-star reviews? That helps push it up the algorithm so that more people can find out about this. We're just grateful that you listen and that you watch and that you participate. We would love for you to leave comments we can respond to, or shoot us an email if you have any questions. info@conduitchurch.com. You can find out more about our home church here in Franklin, Tennessee by visiting conduitchurch.com.